Sailors desperately prayed for death instead of keel hauling. Bound in ropes, they were dragged beneath the barnacle-crusted hull of their ship. Their flesh split open, their faces tear apart, and their lungs filled with seawater until the body convulsed in hopeless panic. Keel hauling was the slowest, most excruciating punishment a sailor could face. This is the bitter truth about keel hauling that they don't want you to know. The first drag. Flesh against the barnacles. The punishment of keel hauling began in the most direct and terrifying way possible. A sailor accused of mutiny, theft, cowardice, or defiance would be seized by the crew and bound tightly with rope. His wrists and ankles were tied so firmly that circulation often stopped, causing his hands and feet to swell before the ordeal even began. A heavy weight, sometimes made of iron or lead, was tied to his legs to ensure that he could not float. From the beginning, the sailor knew he was being prepared for an ordeal that most men did not survive. His lips would tremble as he tried to form words. Sometimes he begged for mercy, his voice cracking as he looked desperately at his shipmates. Some men screamed and cursed, others sobbed openly, and a few simply shook so hard their bodies could not stay still. The condemned man was then thrown into the sea beside the ship. In that instant, he was at the mercy of both the water and the jagged underside of the vessel. The ship itself was not smooth. Wooden ships of the 17th and 18th centuries carried layers of barnacles, shells, and hardened marine growth on their hulls. These barnacles were razor-sharp and extremely hard. They could slice into the skin with the same effect as broken glass or jagged stone. The condemned sailor would immediately feel his body being forced against this surface. The first tear in his skin would pull a scream from his throat that was immediately swallowed by the water. As the rope was pulled from the opposite side of the ship, the man was dragged beneath the keel. His body would scrape against the hull, and the barnacles would cut into every part of him. His back, chest, arms, legs, and face were torn open as he was pulled through the water. The cuts were not clean like those from a blade. They were ragged and uneven, tearing away skin in long strips. Soft areas of the body, such as the eyes, lips, and stomach, were especially vulnerable. Survivors were sometimes described as looking like their skin had been peeled away in patches. On deck, his shipmates stood frozen. Many bit their lips until they bled, fighting back tears as they listened to the muffled cries vanish beneath the waves. Some clutched their arms tightly to stop their trembling. Every man watching felt his own breath shorten, knowing that he could be next. Breathing during the drag was impossible. The sailor was held underwater and disoriented by the movement. He swallowed large amounts of seawater, which often caused choking, vomiting, or convulsions. Panic set in quickly as the lungs filled with water. Many lost consciousness before even reaching the opposite side of the ship. The fear of drowning, combined with the pain of the barnacle cuts, made this first pass under the ship one of the most horrifying experiences a human being could endure. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe how the sea itself turned against the sailor. As his wounds opened, the salt water rushed in and burned the raw flesh. Salt water is extremely painful in open wounds because it irritates the exposed nerves. The pain was so severe that some men went into shock before they even surfaced. The water around the ship often turned red with blood, and the crew standing above could see the trail as the body was dragged. For some men, the first drag was the end. They either drowned, suffocated, or went into cardiac arrest from the pain and shock. Others survived long enough to be pulled out on the opposite side. Survivors did not emerge intact. Their skin was shredded, their faces mutilated, and their bodies sometimes unrecognizable. The bleeding was heavy and unstoppable. Some men lost so much blood during the first drag that they collapsed immediately on deck. The first drag was often enough to kill or destroy a sailor, but the condemned sailor's broken body is only part of the story. The real power of keel hauling is the authority it gives the captains. Captains who turned men into meat. Keel hauling existed in a world where the captain's word was absolute law. On a ship at sea, there were no courts to appeal to, no magistrates to oversee decisions, and no outside authority to intervene. The captain's command carried the power of life and death. A sailor who spoke out of turn, answered back, or simply caught the captain's dislike could find himself tied to the keel. The punishment was meant to crush rebellion, but many captains used it to remind their men that every breath they took depended on his approval. Some captains ordered keel hauling not for mutiny or desertion, but for petty reasons. A man might be accused of laziness, disrespect, or sloppy work. There are accounts of sailors who were dragged under simply because they had insulted an officer, spilled a meal, or failed to salute quickly enough. What was supposed to be a rare punishment for the most severe crimes became, in the hands of cruel commanders, a personal weapon of humiliation. There are reports of captains who enjoyed these moments. Some would sit comfortably in their chairs, a cup of wine or rum in hand, and watch the condemned being tied. They would laugh out loud, treating the screams as if they were part of a spectacle. A few passed comments to their officers, mocking the sailor's appearance or calling him names as if he were less than human. Words like coward, fool, or dog were shouted from above while the man below struggled to breathe. Some captains even leaned over the rail to hurl insults directly at the victim, taunting him while his lips trembled and his eyes pleaded for help. The helplessness of the condemned sailor in those moments was unbearable. His face was wet with tears before he even hit the water, and his body shook violently as the ropes dug deeper into his skin. He could hear the captain's laughter above him, and he knew that no begging, no cries for mercy would change anything. The crew felt their stomachs twist. Many wanted to look away but did not dare. They kept their eyes fixed on the deck or the sea, their arms trembling at their sides. The silence of the crew during these punishments was telling. Few dared to speak or cry out. Most stood rigid, their jaws clenched and their eyes fixed on the deck, because to show sympathy was to risk being accused of disloyalty. Sailors who witnessed their shipmates shredded alive often described the silence as worse than screaming. It was not the noise of anger or outrage. It was the silence of fear. Watching a man dragged under and torn to pieces showed every sailor that their loyalty meant nothing. The only guarantee was obedience, and even obedience could be ignored if a captain wanted to make an example. Some captains were known for using keel hauling repeatedly as a tool to hold their crew in constant terror. Sailors serving under these commanders often described living in a state of permanent dread, knowing that even small mistakes could lead to a death more horrifying than battle itself. In naval records, there are examples of entire crews that never mutinied, not because they respected their captain, but because they were broken by fear. Soon, this terror was not confined to one ship or even one navy. The practice spread outward, carried across nations and oceans, until it became a tool of fear recognized wherever ships sailed. Torture that became law of the sea. The origins of keel hauling can be traced to the Dutch Navy in the 17th century. Unlike random acts of cruelty or private revenge, the Dutch made it a part of their official naval code. By the mid-1600s, it was written into the rules of discipline as a punishment for desertion, mutiny, striking an officer, or refusing to fight in battle. In other words, it was not simply tolerated, it was legalized. The Dutch believed that fear was the only way to keep large crews obedient on long voyages where mutiny could destroy an entire fleet. Codifying keel hauling gave captains a recognized method of terror that was sanctioned by law, not questioned by it. Once the Dutch formalized the practice, others followed. British captains were slower to adopt keel hauling, but records from the 17th and 18th centuries confirmed that it was used. British officers did not carry it out as often, but when they did, it was reserved as the ultimate deterrent. The threat of being dragged under the barnacle-covered hull was often enough to silence dissent without ever having to use it. France also incorporated the practice under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who served as Secretary of the Navy for King Louis XIV between 1669 and 1683. Colbert was obsessed with strict discipline and efficiency in order to build France into a dominant naval power. He believed that punishment must be harsh enough to break any thought of disobedience. Keel hauling was used alongside forced labor on the galleys, where men chained to oars rowed until they collapsed. Crew members were forced to watch, sometimes with their children standing by. This was not unusual. Children were often present on ships during this period. Boys as young as 7 served as cabin boys, running errands and cleaning. Others worked as powder monkeys, carrying charges of gunpowder to the cannons during battles. Some sons of sailors or officers were even brought aboard to learn the trade. One of the most horrifying reports tells of a boy who was forced to watch his own father's punishment. The father had been accused of striking an officer, and the captain ordered keel hauling in front of everyone. As the ropes were pulled tight around the man's body, his son suddenly broke from the line and tried to run to him. Witnesses said the boy screamed his father's name so loudly that it cut through the entire deck. His face was wet with tears, his arms stretched forward, and he tried to throw himself onto his father before the sailors could drag him back. The captain barked out across the deck, "Hold the foolish weakling. Let him watch and learn to be a man." 2 sailors grabbed the boy and held him fast. He fought with every bit of strength he had, kicking, twisting, and crying out until his body shook. His thin arms trembled so badly that the men holding him had to pin him against the rail. He kept begging, his voice breaking apart into sobs, as his father's eyes locked on him one last time. Then the order was given. The father was thrown into the water, and the crew dragged him under. The boy saw the sea churn red as his father's body scraped across the keel. When they pulled him back up, he was torn to pieces, lifeless and broken. The boy went silent at once. His lips quivered, his hands hung loose at his sides, and he did not move. He just stared at what was left of his father. 2 days later, the boy was found dead in his cabin. He had swallowed poison taken from the ship's stores. On the table beside him lay a note written in shaky handwriting. It said, "My father was good. I will go with him. God forgive me. Please take me to him." The crew who found him never forgot it. These were men hardened by storms, hunger, and war. They had seen death many times, but not like this. Some of them cried as they stood over his body. One sailor later admitted that he had nightmares for the rest of his life about that letter. This was the bitter truth of keel hauling. It was not only the condemned who suffered. Families were broken, children were scarred, and crews carried the weight of memories too heavy to bear. By the time the 18th century began, keel hauling had become more than a punishment. It had become an institution. Sailors did not question its fairness. They feared it and obeyed because of it. But to understand the true depth of this horror, it is not enough to know its history. One must see how it was carried out step by step. Step by step, the ritual of slow death. Keel hauling always began with ceremony. It started with the first drag, but what followed was no accident or sudden burst of violence. It was planned, staged, and carried out with cold precision. The crew would gather on deck while the charges were read out loud. This was never about giving the condemned a chance to defend himself. It was a final verdict, a sentence shouted in front of everyone to strip away any last hope. From that moment, the man standing there knew he was already dead. The ropes had been prepared in advance. They were passed under the keel and pulled across to the other side, laid out with care so nothing could go wrong. The condemned was bound so tightly that the ropes cut into his skin. His chest heaved, his lips trembling, as he felt iron weights tied to his legs. Those weights were there to drag him down and stop him from floating. Men watching remembered the look in his eyes at that moment, wide and hollow, like he knew every breath he took would be his last. Then the order for the first drag came, but the ordeal did not end after only one brutal session. The true horror was that it was meant to last. Once the sailor was hauled back up, he was not freed. His body, soaked, cut, and shaking, would be dropped back onto the deck. The ship's surgeon would then step forward. The surgeons who stood on those decks were often desperately wicked men. Their job was not to heal, but to keep the punishment going. The more often they could bring a half-dead sailor back to life, the higher their reputation rose. Some surgeons became known for their ability to drag a man back from the edge of death, not out of pity, but so the captain could order another round of torture. This made them valuable in the eyes of officers and feared by the crew. There are reports of surgeons who did this for more than recognition. Some did it for bribery and gain. To be on the captain's good side meant more coin, more protection, and more power. Every man they revived bought them a little more favor, and they knew it. If the victim did not wake right away, the surgeon's mask of care quickly twisted into rage. They were said to curse at the limp body, spitting out insults like lazy dog or worthless swine, as if the man's refusal to breathe was an insult to their skill. Some pricked the victim with long needles, stabbing the skin of the chest or hands to shock a reaction. There were whispers of surgeons who pinched noses shut, slapped faces until they bruised, or even used burning cloths against the skin to jolt the man awake. Witnesses wrote that this was often worse to watch than the hauling itself. Seeing a man dragged under the ship was horror, but seeing him dragged back onto the deck, gasping, bleeding, and then tortured back into life just so he could be thrown under again, was unbearable. Sailors said they would rather see a comrade buried at sea than dragged back from death only to suffer once more. The surgeon's role became one of the darkest parts of keel hauling. When the condemned finally groaned or gasped, the surgeon would step back with grim satisfaction, proud to have proven himself useful again. He would then signal that the man was still alive and the victim would be dragged back under. Some men endured 2 passes. Others survived 3. There are reports of sailors surviving even 4 passes, each one more horrifying than the last. The crew pulling the ropes slowed their pace with each round, pausing to keep the man pressed against the keel so his wounds could deepen. Many begged for death by the second drag. They screamed until their voices broke into hoarse, broken sobs. Others hung limp, barely conscious, their lips blue, their chests heaving in shallow, uneven gasps. By the 3rd or 4th haul, their bodies were wrecked. Their skin was shredded into strips. Some were reduced to twitching lumps of flesh, barely recognizable as human. Yet if they showed the faintest sign of life, the surgeon made sure they went back under. And for those who survived, the real punishment had only begun. The survivors, worse than death. Surviving keel hauling was often more cruel than dying from it. The men who came back alive were not whole anymore. They emerged with bodies covered in open wounds that bled for days. Salt poisoned their blood and burned into every cut. There was no treatment strong enough to heal them. Even if they could stand, they were unrecognizable, their faces disfigured beyond recognition. Some sailors said survivors looked less like men and more like walking corpses. Without medicine, infections spread quickly. Barnacle cuts were jagged and filthy, filled with seawater, splinters, and dirt scraped from the hull. These wounds rarely closed cleanly. Within days, pus oozed from them, and the stench of rotting flesh followed the man wherever he went. Gangrene crept across arms and legs, turning skin black and brittle. When the fever came, it brought shivering, vomiting, and delirium. Many who survived the punishment itself died days later in their hammocks, eaten alive by the infection. Even those who managed to live carried permanent scars that set them apart from the rest of the crew. Some had chunks of flesh missing from their cheeks or shoulders. These survivors were often treated as cursed. Superstitious sailors believed that men who lived through keel hauling carried bad luck, and many were shunned. The scars branded them not only as victims, but as outcasts. Blindness was also common. The sharp growths beneath the ship often shredded the eyes, leaving survivors stumbling and helpless. Those who were blinded could no longer work the rigging or handle the ropes, which meant they were often cast aside or left behind. Others lost limbs when infections forced amputations. These men lived out the rest of their days crippled, unable to earn a living. They were forced to beg on the docks where they were ridiculed as reminders of the Navy's cruelty. The worst wounds, though, were in the mind. Survivors spoke of waking in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, convinced they were still under the keel. They heard the rush of water in their dreams and clawed at their throats until they bled. Sailors who bunked near them said the screaming never stopped. For many, the trauma was so heavy that they could no longer function as sailors. One account tells of a man named Willem, a Dutch sailor who survived 3 drags under the keel. His body healed, but his mind never did. At night, he would jolt awake screaming, his arms thrashing as if the ropes were still tied around him. He begged for water to be pulled from his lungs, even though he was lying on dry boards. His shipmates whispered that he talked to ghosts, pleading with the sea to let him go. Over time, Willem stopped eating. He sat alone, staring at the horizon with wide, empty eyes. His mates avoided him, too shaken by his hollow muttering. Eventually, he slipped into madness. Reports say he tore at his own skin with his nails, convinced barnacles were still inside him. He died not from his wounds, but from a mind that never returned from under the keel. But even in an age of brutal discipline, there came a time when navies realized this horror had gone too far. Too horrifying, even for the age of blood. The 17th and 18th centuries were some of the most brutal in recorded history. Men and women were hanged in public squares, thieves lost their hands in front of jeering crowds, and soldiers were flogged until the skin peeled from their backs. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, and executions were often drawn out for spectacle. Yet even in this world of casual cruelty, keel hauling stood apart. It was seen not simply as harsh, but as monstrous. By the early 18th century, even the Dutch, who had been the first to codify it, began to turn away. Dutch admiralties reviewed the effects of the punishment and recognized it for what it was, a method of mutilation that destroyed sailors instead of disciplining them. A dead or ruined sailor could not fight, work, or contribute to the fleet. The admiralties banned keel hauling and replaced it with punishments that were still severe but more practical, such as flogging, confinement, or forced labor. These were brutal, but they left men alive enough to keep serving. The shift was not motivated purely by compassion. It was driven by the realization that terror had a cost the Navy could no longer afford. The British followed suit, although their use of keel hauling had been far less frequent to begin with. British captains came to rely on flogging, irons, bread and water diets, and in the worst cases, hanging from the yardarm. These methods were cruel, but they were also efficient and controlled. They kept crews fearful without leaving men crippled and unable to work. A navy that relied on discipline also needed manpower, and keel hauling wasted both. At the same time, the Enlightenment began to reshape European thought. Philosophers such as Cesare Beccaria argued that punishment should serve law, not vengeance. Beccaria's work on Crimes and Punishments, 1764, stressed that certainty of punishment was more effective than severity. For naval leaders steeped in old traditions of fear, this thinking was radical. But over time, even hardened commanders began to accept that discipline could be enforced without tearing men to pieces beneath their ships. By the dawn of the 19th century, keelhauling was no longer practiced in Europe's major navies. It lingered in memory, in stories passed from sailor to sailor, but it no longer appeared in codes of law. Yet its disappearance did not erase its scars. Keelhauling left behind a legacy of fear that outlived the punishment itself. Sailors dreaded it more than death, because death ended pain. Keelhauling was worse. It turned pain into something endless, stretching it across flesh, bone, and memory, long after the ropes were cut. What do you think about keelhauling? Comment down below.